Can everyone hear me okay? Does this get excellent, wonderful. Thank you again for the kind invitation to come here and talk to you about this, as has already been said, very, very topical and relevant issue, albeit one that has been going on for what will soon be 3 years, at least from the point of the referendum result. It has been a very busy time, not just in the UK, but in the EU as a whole, on the issue of Brexit, in particular in the last few weeks. In trying to come up with a sort of sense of what to do today, I very much felt that it was somehow important to explain a little bit of the context behind very recent developments domestically in the UK related to the Brexit issue. In particular, the issue of Parliament having a say in what's known as meaningful votes on the withdrawal agreement. In other words, the role of Parliament in essentially agreeing to whatever withdrawal agreement the government comes up with the EU, or agrees with the EU. Secondly, the issue of indicative votes. My understanding is this has been quite widely reported on the news when Parliament very recently, more specifically the House of Commons, was voting on a series of Brexit options, and this was seen as very much a break from normal practice in the Westminster Parliament, but one that ultimately didn't lead to any major revelations in terms of how to proceed with the Brexit process. And thirdly, the issue of extension of Article 50, which, as those of you watching the news will no doubt be aware, Theresa May is presently at an emergency EU summit to discuss a new request for an extension to Article 50. And in fact, there's been a lot of movement in the UK Parliament on this issue to try and involve Parliament more in trying to decide whether to have an extension and, more crucially, how long the extension should be. So the theme very much of this talk is about the allocation of power within the Constitution as a result of Brexit. Now, that's too big a topic for one short talk. I'll be aiming for about 40 minutes, all being well, to allow some discussion time, but it's at least a starting point to this very complex question. Our understanding of the balance of power between the government and the Parliament has been tested as a result of Brexit. And so these 3 areas I've identified to talk to you about today are very much areas where this tension, as it were, or new tensions between the government and the Parliament have come about. Now, some of my slides will be quite text-heavy, but that is mostly to make sure that I don't lose my place, because there have been an awful lot of votes recently, and it's difficult to keep track of all of them. But what I wanted to do first was give you a sense of key moments up until now. In other words, going up to the end of last year. As everyone will know, the referendum was in the summer of 2016, and there was a majority in favour of leaving the EU. Since then, a series of events have taken place, and the first thing that really happened concerned the power to trigger Article 50. And what we saw was this sense of political willingness or mandate to trigger Article 50. The people, it was said, have voted to leave the EU. We must do this. And an immediate constitutional crisis over, okay, but who has the power under the Constitution to actually trigger Article 50? If you look at the wording of Article 50, it says you must do so in accordance with your own constitutional arrangements. You did write it down, didn't you? No, we didn't. So we're going to have a bit of a disagreement in the UK as to what the rule is. This led to a very seminal UK Supreme Court case about whether or not it was the government alone who could trigger Article 50. As the executive, as the people in charge of foreign affairs and international negotiation, ordinarily under the prerogative, they claimed they had the power to do this. But it was proven in that case that actually they couldn't do it unilaterally. They couldn't do it alone. Parliament had to authorize them through legislation to trigger Article 50. So very early on, we're seeing some battles going on between the government on the one side and the idea of the role of the democratically elected legislature on the other. A number of other things happen, but the key thing was that after that result, Parliament passed a piece of legislation that gave the Prime Minister the power to trigger Article 50, and she did on the 29th of March 2017. 2 years down the line, 29th of March 2019 would have been exit day, as we know, but it did not happen, and we'll explain a bit about the forces behind that. You then had an election which very much weakened the Prime Minister's strength in the House of Commons, which is in part the reason why she's having such difficulty today in trying to convince the House of Commons that her withdrawal agreement is the best deal to take. Crucially, we have the passing of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, which was designed, it did several things. It put exit day, or Brexit day as some call it, into domestic law in the UK, and it was 29th of March 2019. As we will see, that had to change, obviously, and it will no doubt possibly have to change again, depending on the outcomes of today's summit. But it also made provision for the continuation of EU law after British exit from the EU. It's a very complicated piece of legislation, but essentially wanted to copy-paste most of EU law and make it UK domestic law, to take effect only when the UK leaves the EU in terms of that. We, of course, had the eventual finalisation of the withdrawal agreement and the beginning of the parliamentary process, which is what I'll focus on today, but also towards the end of last year, another interesting judicial involvement. At the beginning of the Brexit process, the question was very much who had the power to trigger Article 50. Towards the back end of this process, if indeed this is the back end of this process, and not merely the end of the beginning or any of these other things that I've been told by many that there are many years of this uncertainty to come, we had another major case, a Scottish case actually, that went to the European Court of Justice on whether or not the UK could unilaterally revoke Article 50 and change its mind. And the European Court said, yes, you can. And very much that has had an influence on the debates within the House of Commons, because this case was actually brought by politicians from the multiple parliaments of the UK wanting to know what the law was so that they could make a more informed decision when they were debating the withdrawal agreement in the House of Commons and so on. So what I want to begin with is the idea of the meaningful votes. As I've already mentioned, ordinarily, the government would say that it has the power to negotiate treaties, it's its constitutional role, as it were, to deal with foreign affairs. Parliament for a long time was said to not really be needed on this. The government really didn't want Parliament determining too much the scope or scale of the negotiations. Negotiations, the government said, had to be kept secret. You know, we don't want to show our cards. We want to get a best deal for Britain, all of the usual stuff. But in order to pass the EU Withdrawal Act, in order to set up the legal framework for British withdrawal and to provide a retention of EU law after exit day for at least a short period to prevent a cliff edge situation, Section 13 was enacted, and Section 13 gives the House of Commons in particular a special role in actually approving any withdrawal agreement, and crucially, a political declaration, basically a sort of a politically binding but not legally binding promise as to what any future negotiations and trade agreements might be, that both of these must be approved by the House of Commons before, well, not only that, it has to be approved by the House of Commons and then once approved, put into legislation, and then only when those two things happen is the agreement essentially ratified. So the government can't act alone on this. Whatever agreement it comes up with, it must convince the House of Commons to do it. This has been the reason why the House of Commons has been such a big focus in the Brexit debate in the last few months, because under the law now, Parliament has this role. Interestingly enough, this provision says that if they reject the Prime Minister's deal, the Prime Minister must come back and explain to the House what she plans to do next. We know that that means more often than not that she will put the vote to them again until they agree, not necessarily that she will do anything else. So it doesn't put a limit on how many times this vote can be put to them. But it's very much set up the arena in which this political battle was going to proceed, and it's the reason why we have the focus now. Now, it was supposed to be one meaningful vote. As I said, it actually turned into several. The first vote on her Prime Minister's agreement was due to be in December. But last minute, she decided it would be better to cancel that vote. And now she wanted to cancel it because, by all accounts, it looked like she wasn't going to win it. And so she felt she needed a bit more time to convince the House of Commons. There was a variety of reasons why the House of Commons didn't want to support the agreement. It was often said that it was the issue over the backstop in Northern Ireland that that was the most prominent, but there are also general disagreements over the content of the agreement as well. So it was delayed. We all had a nice Christmas. Everyone was wondering when we would do this again, and when we would do it again. Eventually there was a second vote. There was a first vote, in January, and she lost the vote by 230, a majority of 230 against her deal. She then, as I said, decided we'll have another one, which she did a bit later, and she lost that as well. But now the majority was cut a bit to only 149. And then the speculation began as to, will there be a third vote? And indeed, as we will see, there was also talk as to whether there would be a fourth vote. So what you were having was the Commons was required to approve the deal, and they were saying they didn't like it. And the Prime Minister was insisting that this is the best deal, and there are no other deals. And if it's not this, it's no deal, because under domestic law and under EU law, the UK is leaving on the 29th of March. Therefore, if we don't leave with a deal, this deal, we just have a no-deal situation. We can't leave without a deal, is the argument. There was no question at this stage, really, about the possibility of a second referendum in any real sense, or any sense of a complete revocation of Article 50. Interestingly enough, what happened in March is that when the government suggested we're thinking of doing a third vote, the Speaker of the House, a man called John Bercow, and I'm told he's becoming increasingly more well-known around the globe now, John Bercow, usually for how he shouts things like order and unlock, and I will not try and imitate that with the same level of enthusiasm. But he's become a bit of a star, you might say, in the Brexit process. He made an absolutely amazing decision, which really took everyone by surprise, which was you can't have a third vote if it's exactly the same. Now, what they mean is they put a motion, a proposition to the House of Commons that says we support this agreement. And he says it can't be the same motion. It must be substantially different. In other words, it was seen as you have to change your agreement a little bit because you can't keep wasting House of Commons time pushing the same deal forward. And he made this decision citing a convention, a practice, dating back to 1604. Which I just absolutely love, because I think that if you ever want to understand the idea of precedent and practice politically under the Constitution, then this is it. And he cited the book of Erskine May, which is kind of like a textbook on how Parliament operates, and it cites all the precedents of the decisions of the Speaker of the House. So he made this ruling and said you can't do it unless it's different. He reiterated this a bit later, and so everyone was wondering, what are we going to do? Can the government put a third vote to it? Could the government put a motion to the House and say that we decide to ignore the Speaker of the House's decision and do it anyway, which is possible? Although John Bercow suggested he wouldn't allow that either. So what we're seeing is the Speaker of the House perhaps taking on a more prominent role, completely constitutionally. The Speaker is allowed to make these decisions. But we've never really been in a political situation when these rules have had to be tested quite so much, at least not until 1604, which for any historians in the room would know was a somewhat turbulent time in the UK. So that was interesting. But the government did something slightly different, which is that it was getting towards the 28th, 29th of March, and as we'll see, and when I talk about an extension had essentially been granted at this point, and it was either going to be until the 22nd of May if the UK agreed to a deal, or the 12th of April if they didn't. And it was looking increasingly likely at this point that they were not going to get the deal through on the 29th, and therefore the new exit day becomes this Friday. So several interesting things happened. Is that on the day before the original exit day, the 28th of March, the government says is that it's going to put their deal to the Parliament for them to vote on, but it's not a third vote. In other words, it is not a vote in accordance with Section 13 of the 2018 Act that I told you. It is not a vote that would essentially trigger the process for allowing the eventual ratification of the deal. What they said is that we're going to put the withdrawal agreement to the Commons, but not the political declaration. You need both under domestic legislation to approve the deal. And everyone's thinking, well, why are they doing this? And one reason is that if you look at the EU Council decision on the extension, all it says is that you have to agree the withdrawal agreement by the 29th, not necessarily the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Now, there was some disagreement over whether that is exactly what the EU Council meant, and indeed the Parliament spoke about this, several MPs to an extent, that surely they mean they are one in the same. But putting that aside, this was clearly an attempt by the government to try and get an extension until the 22nd of May. We'll worry about the political declaration later. Let's see if we can do this. So on the 29th of March, which was the original exit day, we see a vote being held, and yet again, her Prime Minister's deal is defeated, but now only by a majority of 58. So she's clearly going in the right direction, supporters said. It was a lot, now it's still a lot under ordinary circumstances in the UK. That is a considerable majority against the government. But in Brexit terms, it is relatively modest. So this changed exit day, as we'll get onto, and it is this Friday. And as far as I'm aware, unless anything has happened in the news in the last 30 minutes, it is still exit day. But we'll get now onto this issue of an extension, because crucially, in order to get a further extension, the UK had to do it before the 12th. So we had this meaningful votes issue, specifically about the Prime Minister's deal, and what we're seeing is the Commons essentially saying it doesn't want it. It also voted on several other options during this period. It voted against having a no-deal Brexit several times, quite by a considerable margin in most cases, and indeed voted in favour of having an extension, as we will see. So Parliament has at least said what it doesn't want. As the Prime Minister and the government has said, it hasn't really indicated what it does want yet, but we'll get onto that in a moment. So extending Article 50 then. Briefly, as we know, Article 53 does permit extensions. A separate question, of course, to revocation, but certainly a related one. As I already mentioned, during this period, there was a series of votes in the House of Commons on whether or not to request an extension, and the House of Commons said, we really do want one, we don't want to have a no-deal situation again. A really interesting development happened as a result. The 21st of March was the point in which the first EU summit to talk about possibly granting an extension was then. The day before, the Prime Minister made a rather unprecedented public statement from Downing Street, where she was addressing the public directly and essentially blamed Parliament for everything going wrong, and very much tried to suggest that, very much kind of pitching herself as the shall we say, the promoter of the public interest, that I am here to make sure that the referendum is fulfilled and that Parliament is getting in our way. And this caused a lot of problems in the UK. The House of Commons was not happy with the Prime Minister for this. And on the day that she was actually away from the Parliament talking about the possibility of an extension, MPs in the House were unrestrained in their criticisms of this. And it was seen as, why is the Parliament being pitched as the enemy here? We had no say in the negotiation. We had no say in what the withdrawal agreement should be. Our only role to date has been to say whether we like what you have produced or not. You didn't ask us what we wanted 2 years ago, 1 year ago. That was the line of argument. Before we get on to how they chose to respond to this as a matter of interest, the extension I already mentioned, of course, was agreed, and it was formally accepted by the UK government. And indeed, this is just a copy of the letter that was sent by the relevant government minister saying, thank you very much for the extension, we're happy to agree to that. and it was formally accepted. You did not need Parliament to approve the extension at an international level. It remains the prerogative of the government to agree on an extension. But there was a trick. I already mentioned to you that domestic legislation says exit day is the 29th of March at 11 p.m. So when the government, using its executive authority, agreed to this extension, it had to then change domestic legislation. Exit day under the 2018 Act, as I said, there's the original date, requires secondary legislation. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this concept, but the idea of delegated or secondary legislation, essentially the government has to, through statutory instruments, say that we want to change the date. So you don't need an act of Parliament to change the date in legislation, you just need secondary legislation. But crucially, at the time, you required any change in exit day to be approved by both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. They did agree to this, and they did it within that last week before the 29th, so it was all agreed beforehand, and the law made it very clear it's either the 12th of April or the 22nd of May, subject to the terms of the European Council decision. I mention this now because, as we will see, this law has been slightly changed. And indeed, it was changed very late on Monday this week, because things have been changing rather quickly on this front. Now, this is very wordy, but I need to pitch this to you a bit. I think it demonstrates kind of the theme here a bit of who is in charge of what, and are we ever going to get to a resolution. On the 2nd of April, so that was last week if I recall, members of Parliament did a rather interesting thing. Ordinarily under the Constitution, the business of Parliament, the business of the House of Commons, is seen as the initiative of the government. The government, of course, is drawn from the Parliament. They are meant to have, in theory, the confidence of the Parliament. So the idea is that they are in charge of business. So if they want their bills to get passed, they are given priority. And the internal rules of Parliament permit this. Standing Order 14 is the particular one that gives primacy to government business. On Fridays, government doesn't have primacy of business. That's left to other things. But ordinarily, it is in charge. So it gets to decide what's debated and when. The House of Commons didn't like that too much and decided that they would take control of the business of the House. And they decided that they would do this through amending the business motion to put aside time that week for the House of Commons to debate what it wants to debate. Now, this was rather unprecedented. I'm not really aware of when this has happened, as we'll get on to when we talk about this later. And we'll talk about the votes that they gave. But they did another thing. They voted on the 2nd of April to take control of the business of the House on Wednesday last week. And what happened was that the backbenchers, the non-government, the non-front bench MPs, decided they wanted to try and pass some legislation. This is rather difficult to do. Normally the government is the one who can pass legislation, because the government also has the civil service. And they have lots of experts who can help them write and draft legislation. But the backbench MPs decided to do it instead. And the legislation they wanted to pass last week was a law that would compel the Prime Minister, the day after this received royal assent from the Queen, to request an extension. And that any extension that she requests must be approved by the House of Commons, and the House of Commons essentially has to agree to the length of this extension. And if you read the Act, it generally seems to suggest that it has to be beyond the 22nd. The idea was that the House of Commons would try and change the law to prevent a no deal from happening this week, to compel the Prime Minister to go to Europe and request a further extension. So they started doing this last week. They had complete control of the House on Wednesday. They passed it in a day in the House of Commons. It went to the House of Lords, and at the start of this week on Monday, they approved it. They made a few changes. So they sent it back to the Commons. The Commons, in an hour, debated it and agreed to all the changes. And by the end of Monday, the Queen had signed it off. And so we have now the European Union Withdrawal Act 2019, which at the start of this week I had written down as the European Union Withdrawal Bill number 5. So this now became the law. At the same time that this was happening, and bearing in mind it normally takes months to pass legislation, on the same day as backbenchers voted to take control of the House to have these votes, the Prime Minister says, well, you know what, I'm going to ask the European Union for an extension. So at the same time that Parliament is trying to pass a law to compel her to do it, she's already said she's going to do it. And this was after she had about a 7-hour meeting with her cabinet, which by all accounts did not go particularly smoothly. She then said that I'm going to request an extension and speak to the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, to try and come up with a consensus that the House can support. Now, that's had a lot of political ramifications as well, but I won't get into that. I'll try and stick with the law. So she says that she was going to do this anyway, and it was quite clear at this point that the summit would be today, 10th of April. We knew this last week. So what's happened then is that she said she was going to ask for an extension anyway. At the time or before, the House of Commons said they were going to legally compel her to ask for an extension. And so on Monday, they passed the law, and in accordance with the law, the government yesterday put a motion to the House of Commons saying, will you please approve our request for an extension until the 30th of June? And the House of Commons agreed. And so the Commons is now in agreement with the Prime Minister that we should request an extension until the 30th of June. But there were two completely separate routes to get into this point. Two branches of government had independently decided they wanted an extension, but clearly there was concerns over the length of the extension. But in the end, they seemed to agree that June the 30th was a reasonable extension at this stage. Of course, those who are following the news know that the likelihood of a 30th of June extension is maybe not great. There is talk about either a very lengthy extension of up to a year, or possibly no extension at all. But we were in this position not so long ago, so we'll see what happens today. But this is two independent efforts by two branches of the state to try and find an extension. And I thought it was rather amusing how everything seemed to come together at a sort of unique time in order to allow that to happen. So we'll see what happens on the extension front. What I wanted to note here very quickly is how the law has changed. I mentioned that exit day must be subject to approval of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In other words, they have to positively agree to a change in exit day for domestic law. Otherwise, if they didn't, and we stayed in the EU, but our domestic law said that EU law wasn't to apply after Friday, we'd be in the EU and in breach of EU law, and they didn't want that. They had to keep the current legal system going, which is the European Communities Act 1972. The Act passed on Monday changes the procedure. And no one was really talking about this until I read the Act. But it's changed it. So now, from Monday, you don't need the House of Commons and the House of Lords to positively agree to your change. We have what is called an annulment process or negative procedure. In other words, unless the House of Commons or the House of Lords actively object to the change in exit day, it is going to automatically happen. So it streamlines the process. So this essentially saves time and potentially prevents either House of Parliament trying to prevent an extension from happening after the Prime Minister has secured an agreement with the EU for an extension. And that seems to be what they're going at. But I wanted to show you something that a law passed in less than a week has dramatically altered domestic procedure in terms of this issue to try and avoid a no deal on Friday. This takes me towards the back end. Now, this is very busy. This is so I don't get lost. Not so long ago, in fact, the 25th and 27th of March, so the same week that would have been the last week that the UK was in Europe at the time, I mentioned before that last week the House of Commons took control of the business from the government in order to pass this legislation. They had already done this a couple of weeks earlier in order to have indicative votes. In other words, we knew by that point that the House of Commons didn't like the government's deal, but the government didn't seem to want to move on its red lines. So the House of Commons decided, or certain backbenchers decided, that they would have several votes to take control of the business of the House. Yet again, a break in tradition there. Suspend Standing Order 14 and allow the House to decide what options it thinks it wants moving forward for Brexit. There were, as we'll see, 8 proposed motions, 8 options put before the House of Commons. As the House of Commons was debating these 8 motions, the Prime Minister was meeting with representatives of her own party. And she apparently said to them that, well, look, if you support my deal, I'll resign. So as the Commons was debating this point, there was already movement there that possibly the Prime Minister would want to not be the Prime Minister much longer, that this might change attitudes in the Commons, that if some people in the Conservative Party felt that they could have a leader in the not-too-distant future who might represent their interests better, that they might support the Prime Minister's deal in order to secure that. But not much has happened on that point. What I wanted to say was there were 8 possible options. The House of Commons rejected all 8. There was no majority for any single option. The options varied. 2 of them, at least, were seen as variations on what they call the Norway model, or the Common Market 2.0 is what it was called. They were not terribly popular, nor was the idea of having a no-deal exit, let's just go. 400 MPs said no. I should stress there are 650 MPs in the House of Commons, so if 400 of them are voting against something, it's pretty safe to say that there's a majority against it. Alternative options were put forward. The opposition party put forward its plan, but that didn't go very far. One of the more popular options was a customs union. That had been ruled out by the government for quite some time, but still didn't get a majority. There was talk about let's revoke Article 50 if we can't get a deal, but that didn't quite make it either. And various other small ones. Another key one was, why don't we have a referendum on the Prime Minister's deal? In other words, if the House agrees to the deal, subject to a confirmation vote in a referendum in the UK, that might be a way of striking a compromise. In other words, if the House of Commons isn't going to agree to the deal, put it to the public. If the public want the deal, then we'll accept it. That wasn't popular either. But in typical fashion, despite the fact that all 8 had been defeated, there was time set aside on the 1st of April for another go. And yes, it was April Fool's Day, and it was widely spoken of in the media that it was April Fool's Day, but it was no joke. This was going to happen. Some of you may have seen in the news, and I don't know, that there was a petition in the UK to have a sort of second referendum, a revocation of Article 50. And it attracted over 6 million signatories. A petition normally requires 100,000 votes to be discussed in the Parliament. It got 6 million. That was quite staggering. So it had to be discussed in the Parliament. They did discuss it in the Parliament, but in Westminster Hall at the same time that the House of Commons was debating another set of options. So it didn't get much press. So that was an interesting point, and itself got a lot of criticism. But there was 4 additional options put to the public based on the original 8, and the House of Commons rejected all 4. Customs union came up again and only lost by 3, so that was an improvement. Common market came up again. Let's have a Norway-style model. Didn't really. 61 of MPs wanted it. Let's have a second referendum to confirm the vote. Came closer. Closer than was expected. It lost still, but had actually the most votes in favour of all the options, and that was said by a few members of Parliament at the time. Another one was we should revoke Article 50 if we don't get a deal, but that didn't fly either. So we narrowed it down, 8 to 4. Maybe we should have another go, the House of Commons says. And what Jeremy Corbyn said in Parliament was, well, the Prime Minister's had 3 goes at her deal, we should have 3 tries as well. But didn't quite work out that way. The House of Commons put it to the vote on the 3rd of April. Do we want to take control of business again? Do we want to have these votes? And they tied. There was 310 for and 310 against. This had not happened and since 1993 with what? The Maastricht Treaty. And the Speaker of the House was asked this. When did this last happen? He said, well, it was the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. And everyone's like, of course it was. So what happens here is, I mentioned John Bercow, who made that sort of very interesting decision about precedent, which we hadn't really seen before, not since 1604. Well, probably a bit later, but no one cited the other precedents. But he had the casting vote. That's the rule. The Speaker of the House, when it's tied, has to decide one way or the other. And citing again, established practice says, well, look, I have to decide with the government on this. I have to decide with no. We can't do this because I have to not create a majority in favor of a change. If it comes down to this, I have to maintain the status quo. And so he cast his vote, and it was 311 to 310, and so there wasn't going to be a third round of votes. This leads me, hopefully, roughly, almost on time, is that we've seen this disagreement going on between the government and between the Parliament, trying, in fairness, to come up with a solution to what to do next. And what I was originally going to say is, on this is, well, where are we now? And then I realized that we weren't really anywhere. And then I wanted to say, where are we going? And I didn't really have an answer to that either. And so I just thought what next seemed to be more appropriate. And what I have is really just a series of questions that we do not know the answer to. And so one question is, if we get an extension, how long is the extension going to be for? Will it be, if it is a year, will that be acceptable to the Parliament? Will that be acceptable to the parties? I have to also say that I was changing this as things went. So did it get royal assent? Yes, it did. So I didn't have time to change that before I had this presentation. I could only change so much. So we know that's happened. Will the two main party leaders reach an agreement? They have been negotiating, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, for several days now, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence of them reaching a consensus. But if they do, will the House of Commons like it? It's one thing to say that both parties have agreed to it. The one thing that we have seen during this process is a breakdown in party discipline. Ordinarily, you're going to vote with your party, along party lines, on key votes. That has completely collapsed. That it is not normal for Parliament to take control of business of the House. It's not normal for them to vote against their party in such large numbers. But they have done so continuously during this process, and it seems to be slightly more normal now for people not to vote along party lines, at least when it comes to Brexit. So we don't know if that's going to happen. The big question really is, well, look, the European Court of Justice has told us we can revoke if we want. If we cannot reach a deal, are we going to keep asking for extension after extension, or are we going to either just leave or revoke Article 50? Another interesting question. If we do decide to revoke Article 50, you might remember I said at the start, the big Miller case, who has the power under the Constitution to trigger Article 50? Had to have a big case about it. Nobody knew. Nobody knows how we can untrigger it. We actually don't know what the Constitution says. Myself and my good colleague, Dr. Adeline Wilson, have actually written on this ourselves, and we think that it's possible it could exist under the 2017 Notification of Withdrawal Act, but others think you need a separate Act of Parliament, some think it's the prerogative. So it's entirely possible that if we get to the stage where we decide we want to leave, we might have to have another court case to figure out how we do it. So it's not impossible. So we can only get so far in this process without actually having even more unanswered questions. Will the Prime Minister resign? If so, when? She had Prime Minister's questions today, and people are now speculating that she doesn't want an extension beyond June 30th because she maybe doesn't anticipate being here that long. We don't know. We actually don't know if it would make any difference. If she does resign, if she doesn't, are we going to have an election? Might be more likely if we get a year-long extension, if that's enough time. Maybe we can sort things out, who knows. But essentially, the situation is complicated. A lot of the ordinary rules of practice of government primacy in the House of Commons have largely been tested, and they have collapsed in the last few weeks. Whether or not there are probably clearly wider lessons for us to learn constitutionally on this in the time to come, whether or not we will ever make any reforms or anything else to try and streamline this procedure, assuming that we think we will ever need it again, of course, is unknown. Brexit is seen as a one-off, unique, not normal situation, and we're doing our best to deal with it. But it does raise much wider questions over the nature of the Constitution and essentially who is responsible for what. And needless to say, there has been lots of academic commentary on it, which I shan't go into detail with, but this is an ongoing debate in the UK. So I'm conscious now of time, but I just want to say thank you. Hopefully that has clarified some of what has happened in the last few weeks, and obviously I'm happy now to pass over to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this really interesting, enlightening lecture, which will, of course, well, as you can see here, there are a lot of questions. And one of the things I learned now is something which is kind of also very important for us to remember. What is the function of law? What is also the function of constitutional law? To give some kind of predictability. And if you see here, if a constitution is based on the goodwill of the parties involved, the branches of law, and they are suddenly not acting according to the established rules, then we have a problem. Obviously, as you can see here, Germany has made its own experience with this at the end of the Weimar Republic, and you all know this didn't went very well. Not for us, not for Europe. So let's hope that the situation is not getting that worse in the UK case. However, this is of course concerning. If suddenly the actors in the constitutional actors are no longer abiding to the established constitutional rules, or at least not in a foreseeable way, that even a constitutional lawyer as Robert has no clear answer to what will happen next. But still, I would like to ask you the question, what do you think? Will there be a Brexit or not?
I don't know. I'm thinking of all the many responses MPs have said to that question, which is well, I couldn't comment, but what I would say is will we, won't we? I don't know. I mean, it's entirely possible that I'll be stranded here on Friday. So I mean, it's getting. What I would say is that for a long time, it didn't seem politically like there was much option other than to implement the referendum, get a deal, and leave. And what we're seeing is we're getting towards the what should have been the final stages of that process, and people are starting to question and rethink, do we want a Brexit? If so, what type of Brexit? If we can't agree on the type we want, are we better to stay in? These are questions that are now being posed quite actively when they weren't being really talked about in any serious manner even before Christmas. You know, the political idea was we must stick with this. We don't want to upset the 17.4 million that voted to leave. What I didn't mention here, of course, is the role of referendums is a relatively new and unknown thing in the UK, and it has caused a big headache for everyone in government. The role of the people in direct democracy is part of this equation. And the extent to which one vote on an abstract question is enough, or whether or not we should have several or not any at all anymore, is part of the ongoing debate. Do we want a future for referendums to do this? So we're getting to the point where I imagine we are narrowing down the answer, possibly. If there's a year-long extension, to be honest, it probably opens up the whole thing again. And you might have an election in a sense of, do we want to continue? Can we reopen the negotiations? But this depends on what the EU wants as well. And I think we're getting to the point where everyone is getting tired. And everyone really kind of wants a solution, whatever it is. So that's the best hedged answer I can give.
Thank you. I just want also to, we have seen these different options, and of course you do not have the time to go through everything here. However, I would love to ask Christian about, could you elaborate about this Norwegian model? Because if there's something is probably interesting also for us here in Norway, they are having one of these models, the Common Market 2.0. So Christian, could you please explain to our audience what that means? Yeah, please.
Thanks very much, and thanks for a great presentation. I mean, there are lots of things which me, as a UK citizen, I'm going to be directly affected by Brexit. I'm going to become a third country national in Norway when and if this actually happens. Søren asked me if I could come to your talk today, and I said, of course I'm going to come to the talk, but little did I know that he actually expected me to talk when I was here, but I guess there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? But no, the indicative votes, I mean, I did actually have a number of questions for you, but in terms of explaining what the different options are, I mean, well, quite simply, the Common Market 2.0, EEA through EFTA, negotiate a temporary customs union is exactly what it says on the tin, right? I mean, it's essentially, you would have to become a member of EFTA, which then means that Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein have to agree to the UK becoming a part of EFTA, which is not necessarily a given, obviously, because you have Norway as the largest country out of three, which is the big brother in that situation, all of a sudden becomes the very minuscule brother compared to the massive UK coming in.
That's been said in Parliament, actually.
Exactly. So that's not a given, but let's say they did become a part of EFTA, then they'd be able to apply to join the EEA agreement on the EFTA side. So it'd be switching sides over there. But one of the questions that I had to you, because I've been thinking about this, indicative votes. Mm-hmm. I mean, meaningful votes, fair enough. You know what the meaningful vote is about. It's been explained by Robert. It's all about whether Parliament can agree to the deal that May was able to negotiate. Mm-hmm. But indicative votes, indicative of what?
A good question. It's often said, well, what's the purpose behind these votes? You know, if they I said to you that they didn't vote for any of them. If they did vote for one of them or several of them, would anything happen? Well, not necessarily, because these are indicative. They are merely expressions of what the House of Commons wants. They are best political. They are not actually binding. They are designed to give an impression, probably to government, as to where there might be room for change in the agreement or trying to come up with sufficient changes to allow them to agree to it. Hence the reason why some are very basic. Well, why don't we have a customs union in conjunction with everything else? Or why don't we just scrap the whole thing and leave, if that's what they want? So they're not binding. It's important to stress as well, you'll note, that when the House of Commons was trying to express what does it want, the government did not put forward a motion to include its own deal as an option. Now, it had already been voted against 2 times by this point, and by a 3rd time as well. So they really weren't participating with it, and they tried to stop it happening. They didn't want it to happen. This was very much the House of Commons doing it, but there was no guarantee that the government would necessarily listen to any outcome. But as the government said themselves, they didn't vote for anything, therefore, what a waste of time, they said. But whether they're, you know, I mean, the House of Commons reaction to that was, yes, but you've had 2.5 years and we've had 2 weeks. Yeah. So.
Exactly, and I've also been thinking, I mean, when we talk about being indicative votes and indicative of what is it actually they're voting on? Because if you look and it says, well, Common Market 2.0 to join the EEA, or to remain in the EEA and apply, I mean, all these different options which basically refer to a Norway Plus model or the Common Market 2.0, which is basically the EEA model, but with perhaps a customs union or maybe just a customs union. Mm-hmm. Are they really talking about anything connected to leaving, actually just the agreement to leave the EU as such? Because I've always been thinking this has actually got more to do with the future relationship, hasn't it?
It's a good point. It's often a thing that has been said, that the withdrawal agreement is about the withdrawal. It is about us getting to the point where the UK formally leaves. The political declaration on future framework is us then beginning the process of deciding what long-term future relationship we want to have with the European Union. And that is where, it's part of the reason why all of the drama at the moment is only on that initial, do we walk through the door, into the outside, and then talk about where we're going to go and how we're going to do it, and you know whose car we're going to be in, and all of the usual stuff you do on a trip. They haven't got to that yet. So what you're seeing is a degree of concern over the future after you begin withdrawal. And the extent to which the agreement needs to cover some of this is not necessarily clear. And the government has said if you want a customs union, it's still conditional on the withdrawal agreement being agreed. So you still must agree to what I've put forward. We can worry about the customs union stuff later. So yes, it has been noted several times that one of the reasons why the political declaration wasn't put to the House was for that very reason. What was the other reason? Was the withdrawal agreement is one thing. We can talk about what we want later next week once we've got our extension to the 22nd of May.
Yeah. Exactly. Now, I'm very, very conscious of the fact that I've got loads of questions I could ask you, Robert, but perhaps if people have questions here, they might want to ask their questions.
The last 5 minutes, if you have questions, please. Yes.
There's often talk about...
Can you please take the microphone?
I'll pass it along down there.
Thank you. There is often talked about a Norway Plus model, but what exactly is the plus? Is it the potential customs union?
I don't think there's clarity on what the plus means. I think it would be fair to say that when they were having these votes, it wasn't entirely clear what it was they wanted or didn't want. I mean, it's not something that has ever been part of mainstream debate in the House of Commons. We haven't had a whole... to debate that sort of model, they would need a lot of time to talk about the pros and cons. When this happened, 5 minutes was given. It might have been 8 minutes, if I'm probably being unfair. A few minutes to the proposer to explain the benefits of what it thinks Common Market 2.0 is, and then they sit down, and then someone else stands up and explains why they think we should just revoke, and then they have a bit of a debate about things, and then they all go away and vote on it. So there wasn't enough time to really get a sense of what do they want. I mean, the customs union comes into it. I mean, in some ways it's related to those issues. Why we need to try and protect some of what we have and not just completely get rid of it. But there's actually very little clarity on what it means. And it's never been taken seriously as an option by the government. And they ruled it out a couple of years ago quite strongly, especially at the time when the Scottish government was trying to suggest maybe we could do a slightly different arrangement, have something like a Norway-style one, and it was just completely disregarded. And it came up again almost by surprise when these votes came forward. I should stress that lots of potential motions were put forward on options. The Speaker had to select which ones to vote on based on various factors. So these were the ones that seemed the most popular to put forward. So it actually hasn't really been discussed. They've also talked about a Canada Plus deal, and I'm not entirely sure what they mean by that either. So clearly, like Norway, like Canada, but just slightly better, because that's what we're aiming for. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Another question? Yeah, over there.
I'm just thinking about the routes. What exactly leads the population of the UK to vote in 2016 to leave the...
To leave.
Yeah.
There is no single answer to that question. You can understand why the vote was put forward, because it was a manifesto commitment of the Conservative Party, who, if you're being sceptical of, didn't expect to win that election in 2015. And so the idea that's what skeptics would say, that they made the promise thinking they'd get a coalition government again with the Liberal Democrats and therefore would have to sacrifice it as part of any agreement, but didn't. It's needless to say that the European issue has been a divisive one, certainly in the Conservative Party, but actually across several parties for decades. And it was always being said that there would be a referendum on it if the Conservatives came back to power at some stage. In terms of why people voted the way they did, that's into complex matters of politics. Some of the issues, it was a very short campaign period for a start. It wasn't very long. There was perhaps issues, legally speaking, there were issues over things like parliamentary sovereignty, about state sovereignty. Whether those issues swayed the public is unclear, but certainly those are the issues that the MPs in Parliament in support of Brexit tend to cite. But I couldn't really, unfortunately, speculate. It's politics, and the extent to which we've changed our mind is an unclear point, because talk of a second referendum, it should be stressed, is premised often on the idea that people have changed their mind and would want to remain. There is no guarantee that that would happen, because public opinion seems to be quite split on things, and it depends on the question you're putting to the public. Before it was, do you want to remain or leave? There was no sense of the detail. If you think about what people were being promised, they were promised all kinds of things, extra money for the NHS, new jobs, all kinds of wonderful things. Essentially, and it's been said before, but I think it's very important, the referendum, the government proposed the referendum. The Prime Minister said, we're going to have a referendum, and I am going to support us remaining in the EU. How many people vote to keep everything the same? The status quo is great. I'm really happy with everything right now. I could not possibly be any happier. They were sort of going in at a slight disadvantage because the opponents could say, well, okay, it's okay now, but it could be even better if we leave, whilst the Remains have to say, no, it would be really terrible if we left. And so there's the issue of positive, negative messages in referendums. It's perhaps, they are new things to the UK, and there are plenty of academics across the board who are looking into what role referendums should play. But from the get-go, it seemed like it was hard for a positive Remain message to be given, but it was easier for a positive Leave one to be given. Whether that has now changed in light of various revelations by the Electoral Commission over funding of the campaigns and accuracy of statements is unknown. It's entirely possible the British public would actually support Theresa May's deal. There is evidence that the public has a lot of sympathy for the Prime Minister and don't particularly want the leader of the opposition to take over, at least not at present. So it is a very complex political situation, and it's hard to explain necessarily why it happened, how it happened, and if we were to have a referendum again, that people have sufficiently changed their mind to have a different result. So that's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting debate. Thank you very much, Christian, also for contributing.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everybody, for showing the interest into this topic. And with this, I'll end this session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank
Bye.
you. Thank you very much.